Hello and welcome to the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. We're thrilled to present in-depth discussions on business, global affairs and news across Singapore, ASEAN and the United Kingdom. Thank you for your continued support and we hope you enjoy this episode.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, Jim. And I'm really excited about this conversation because digital sovereignty is something that occasionally comes up, occasionally hits the headlines, but it's not something that I know very much about. So really, let's take it all the way back. And if you could just talk to us, what is digital sovereignty?
So really, if you think about it, we've had this wave of technology that's happened, it's been as long as since I've been working, 30 plus years, but it's really kind of cresting now in a way. And as that happens, technology becomes really more important to companies and becomes more important to countries. And what happened was about 15 years ago or so, countries started to look at information and they looked at technology and say, okay, how can we regulate it? Because they're concerned about risk. They're concerned about societal problems that could emerge from things like that. So if you think about an early example would be GDPR, right? So coming out of Europe, very focused on protecting the individual's right to their data, less focused on some of the bigger issues. But in my work here in this region, the motivations are a little bit different. So I started working around, just when I joined Control Risk about 8 years ago, working on China's cybersecurity law. And looking at, from a Chinese perspective, that's a society that had this amazing adoption of technology. And that what clearly came up right after that was lots of risk. And so what China tried to do, that China cybersecurity law, was to manage that risk, really from the top down. Personal data was part of that, but also general cybersecurity, critical infrastructure, and things like that. So really it's something where, in the past, technology is something that's been considered sort of outside the realm of politics and regulation, and that's changed very, very quickly. So that's where we're living in today.
Okay. So is it just all about control and protection then? Or just elaborate a bit further on what's the motivations for digital sovereignty? So
think about, for a government, for a policymaker, and they think about technology and it's all over the place. There's data everywhere. Your society depends on telecoms, water, power, and you don't know who can get in and change these things, turn these things off, cause security problems. So that first motivation comes out of national security concerns. Right. So again, we've seen this around the world where increasingly critical infrastructure like water, power, but particularly telecoms, financial services, that have been targeted by nation-state actors, cyber criminals, activists, with the intention to disrupt it. And that could have significant consequences for how an economy works, for people's health and safety. So that first motivation is around that. The second one, it's a little bit broader, but it really involves the US and China. And that's the question around strategic competition. So we live in a world now where there really are two tech superpowers, the US and China, and the rest of the world is sort of, by and large, having to sort of take what's on the table, and in some cases maybe having to choose between them. But this idea that there's that competition that's going on that could affect your ability to access technology, or if you use technology, what could be some of the risks around it. So that piece of it is, it underlies it because, like in Singapore, we have Chinese companies, we have US companies, and it's becoming an interesting little mix around what are you doing and which one would you choose. And lastly, there's, related to that, is this idea around supply chain. So again, if we have clients who are in manufacturing really high-tech items that require really high-tech chips. And they sell the same item all around the world, but now they're increasingly wondering if they can sell some of those items in China. And also, in some cases, China is concerned about the provenance of some of those chips, and if those chips are something that could introduce security risks to them. So from a policymaker perspective, they think about national security, they think about these strategic competition issues, they think about these supply chain issues, and they're all trying to get ahead. They're all trying to develop the economy, and so it's a heady mix.
That is. So, right, as you are summarizing there, so we've got the cybersecurity matters, we've got the political drivers.
Indeed.
And then we've got the economy and the protection around how to drive economies faster, effectively. Right, okay. So then let's let's dig into how digital sovereignty, how you're seeing it actually impacting businesses.
So we think about this really in 4 ways. So for a lot of our clients, they're already dealing with compliance issues. So it could be around managing personal data, but depending what kind of field they're in, maybe they're critical infrastructure. So they're a highly regulated sector like banking, that they have these requirements to meet around security that they must do. So that regulatory compliance piece is one area that it's there and it's growing. And it depends country by country what the quantum of that looks like. The next area would be around cybersecurity. So, and that's more so, you have to do this. Those kinds of, generally they're not too prescriptive, but requirements around controls that you must implement. And that becomes tricky for our clients because they may do it one way globally, but suddenly, we have clients, again, in the manufacturing space, they have a global policy around how they do cybersecurity, but now they have a unique requirement in China that they have to implement. What are the implications for that? How do they manage it? The next area would be around, again, that supply chain question, which you're thinking about, I'm going to make this wonderful new product that's going to save the world, but some of these elements, maybe I can't sell it to some countries, or maybe some countries won't allow its use because they're concerned about the security implications for it. And lastly, there's just this operational piece. So we've seen in some countries you can get some global cloud services, and some countries you can't. So it was funny. I was in Hong Kong, it was a while ago, and I went to go look at OpenAI, just ChatGPT, just for research purposes.
No, not for client-facing work.
Can't get into it.
Yeah.
So that happened. It was last summer where they blocked access from China, which would include Hong Kong, to those U.S. AI services. So it's interesting that a lot of our clients are beginning to stub their toes on these kinds of problems, and the complexity of this is only growing.
And is it growing because, we've talked about supply chain, but maybe let's dig in a little bit further to that regulatory situation. So the clients that you're supporting, you're based here in Southeast Asia as well.
Yes.
So how are they starting to navigate this regulatory global requirements? What's the crossover? Are any regulations, really going against each other?
Well, so the biggest, most comprehensive impact is really from personal data regulation. That in most countries that applies to every firm, regardless of the size. And by and large, GDPR did really set like a standard around that. And those regulations, by and large, are about 80% the same, but they're still 20% different. And so different reporting requirements, different handling requirements. And so if you have a single, if you remember years ago, people were saying, bring your data together, data lakes, data warehouses, single point of processing. Now it looks increasingly hard to manage because different data sets, depending on what kind of individual data you may have different rule sets. And so it becomes a nightmare to navigate this. So if you have like a single database of your customers across the region and you have an incident, suddenly you have 12 different reporting requirements, and that's a nightmare. But more broadly around cybersecurity, the banks are quite sophisticated about this because they've had to live this for a longer time. But those cybersecurity requirements and some of the requirements you'd see around that, again, affecting services like AI or hardware such as chips and things like that, it's becoming a much more challenging question around what can you use and how can you use it.
Yeah, and to the point that you've raised a lot, how far do you have to dig into that supply chain before you can feel confident about meeting some of these requirements? Presumably that's really difficult for some of the smaller organizations.
And it's ambiguous, right? So, look, the environment that we're living in now, especially coming from the U.S., it's less, like the policy is more dynamic, if you will. So it's really, really hard to think about what it's going to be like in 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, but you have to make choices that have significant financial implications across sometimes a 3 to 5 year period. So there's that mismatch between this mismatch between sort of those horizons that this one.
Yeah.
Sometimes people have to do that.
Yeah. You did mention the US, China, and now you've mentioned forecasting as well.
Yes.
So when we're thinking about digital sovereignty, is it close your eyes and point, or what's the more practical, sensible steps that organizations can take?
So we've always felt that you need to take a risk-driven approach to these things, especially in an environment where the technology is very new, the policymakers' approach to this is very new, and especially where the geopolitical dynamics are very ambiguous, right? So you need to think about what is it that you're doing, who are your customers, where are you going to be working, and to come up with something a little bit more practical around that. We work with external counsel, with our clients all around the world. It's critical to have, that kind of insight and that kind of guidance, but there is an element that it's a journey without maps. You don't necessarily know what it's going to be like in 6 months or 12 months, and part of that's because of technology, part of that's because of the economic environment, also quite
dynamic.
That's a nice way to put it.
Yeah, there we are.
Well done, Daisy. But just those kinds of things. It's really it's hard to decide what you need to do, and so the practical approach is say, okay, what can I do, and what's the level of risk I'm comfortable accepting?
Yeah. Like with all these, all cyber, all technology adoption, it's always coming back to that risk.
Yep.
But I think digital sovereignty does play an interesting element because risk is always difficult to measure. But I'm not putting words into your mouth. This is my interpretation of it. But when egos start to come into it, when political drivers come into it, a whole another level of complexity.
And think about it. It's just you make these kinds of investments, and it's like AI is a great example. So for a lot of countries all around the world, they sense great opportunity there. It's something that could this be something from productivity perspective that can kind of slingshot us? Can it help us with our technology investment? Can it help us with our efficiency? Like different countries are trying to solve different kinds of problems, but then they start to think, well, what are my dependencies? What would by doing this, could I introduce risk because I'm dependent on this country or this company or things like that? And so you start to see that drive for national champions and that drive to say, okay, well, can we do this internally? Most countries can.
Yeah.
And so how do you sort of come up with a sort of a middle ground where you can work with some of these providers, but you can also satisfy? That's what regulation comes down to, right? And I think a lot of policymakers, tick, 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 not so easy to calibrate.
No. And I suppose, for the policymakers as well, they've got a selected number of large tech companies that they can really, create policy that is practical and that companies can adopt. I mean, I remember, I can't remember quite how many years ago, but we were talking about Europe, trying to invest in their own search engine.
Yes.
So that the sovereignty over search isn't tied to Silicon Valley.
Exactly.
And so what are you seeing right now?
We'll see how that worked out for them.
Yeah. I mean,
but it's just important to remember that nothing is carved in stone. There isn't like a single path. There isn't like a sequence of events that will happen. Like first this will happen, then this will happen. It'll go this way. It'll go that way. I think we're entering into a time where the internet is sort of, in some ways, it's reaching the end of its first stage, and now it's going to change into something else. Like think about, like I remember many, many years ago, my friend who worked in the university, he said, dude, you got to come check this out. It's called Google. And I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Wow.
it's misspelled.
Hypertext, exactly. And you see how that's changed now, and how that's changed sort of operations, and how that's changed technology, and how that's enabled so many companies all around the world.
Yeah.
But now with people looking at AI, and they're looking and saying, are we on the cusp of something new? I don't necessarily know if we really are, but things are definitely changing. And so when there's change, there's also opportunity.
So with AI particularly, so some of the conversations around sovereignty is linked to the content.
Correct.
And
Indeed.
and the data pipelines that are going
Indeed.
into training the AI. So can
Indeed.
you comment on how that comes under data sovereignty?
So if you think about it, in the same way that governments now regulate content, and they do that all over the world, and some companies even self-regulate on content, right? So there could be issues around children or something like that, which something shocking is uncovered, and they want to respond to that. So there's nothing, I mean, that aspect is nothing new. But what's new about sort of with AI is that, and I'm not like an AI. I'm risk about AI. I'm not an AI architect
enabled.
or anything like that.
No, or AI, not AI native.
We should all, exactly. We should all be AI enabled. But think of it this way. I look at it around these kinds of issues in the same way governments want to regulate what people can say, like reasonable or unreasonable, however you may think about that, depending on your own values. But the governments regulate what people say all around the world. They will regulate AI in the same way. And what's harder about AI is that what AI can generate is not so easily controllable. And you can imagine that can create all sorts of different kinds of risks. In a very micro level, you can imagine like, oh, let's set up a chatbot for our business. And it says things that are inappropriate, right? But also it could say, okay, we want to embrace AI for this, this government, project and this government tool. And it starts saying bad things about the government. So, that aspect, and I think that, the AI architects, like the designers, the people, the model builders, that they're grappling with that now. Because what's going to happen is that the government's going to come to them and they will hold them accountable for it.
Yeah, and it would be interesting to see, obviously, here in Singapore, there's a lot of discussion about we're not going to regulate, we're going to put in guidelines, we're going to put in tools that support. EU's obviously gone in a different direction.
Yes,
so it's a really interesting case study to see, what the outcomes are of these two different tracks.
Well, the U.S., I mean,
US as well.
so, at a federal level, they really don't want to regulate it. And similarly to it's an opportunity for crypto as well. So on the one hand, that could create some really, really innovative new technology, but it also could lead to some unanticipated risks.
Yeah.
That's, we don't want anything bad to happen, but it's interesting. It's an interesting challenge for our clients and for societies and for policymakers.
No, absolutely. One of the interesting, slightly change in topic that I was reading up the other day was about data embassies.
Indeed.
Can you share with us?
I don't have any experience with that per se, but the principle would be this, is that in country A, so you have your data, and that could be personal data of individuals, it could be sort of government internal information, processes, whatever it may be. But for whatever reason, it might be because for resiliency purposes, for very small countries like Singapore, you would want to have that data someplace else in case something bad happens, so you don't lose it. It's a very old, it's an old principle
redundancy.
from, exactly.
Yeah.
We've been doing this for years, right? So, but to do that at a societal level is much more complicated, right? So the principle around it, like a data embassy, would be to say, okay, in another country, country B, we'll set up a data center. We will have an agreement that says that at least in a digital context, it is forever a part of country A. And then you apply the rules, and so that way you can say that it might be physically in country B, but it is digitally in country A, which opens up all sorts of new opportunities around sort of how you share data, how you process data, and things like that, but also would introduce concerns around security and access. That element of national security is not going to go away. And so things like encryption, we talked about quantum encryption earlier, we don't have to get into that, but that idea around sort of zero knowledge, meaning that whoever's hosting the data embassy can't see inside the data embassy, will be a critical technology to be able to enable that. And that can be done, but it's tricky.
Yeah, and it all comes back down to trust as well.
Indeed.
And I think the idea of data embassies just shows how maybe fragile's not fair, but it does show how much trust we have to put in these regulations in order to keep the whole machine turning. And I think the idea of having a data center sat somewhere else but under different regulation, all down to trust and who we're going to trust and the allies and the social politics. Yeah, fascinating.
And especially in a time like this where things are changing quite quickly, makes people nervous.
Absolutely, and the technology coming in as well.
Indeed.
Brilliant. So you did give us a bit of a taste in terms of how companies need to be looking forward, but just to round us up, what is the outlook? Where is digital sovereignty going?
More of it coming soon. So as we adopt and we use more of these kinds of cloud-based technologies, AI technologies, and things like that, the more we're dependent on technology, the bigger the societal risk. The bigger the societal risk, the more regulation, which is the policymaker's response to how to solve it. That's unfortunate in some cases, but also in some cases it's necessary. So I look upon this as it's an interesting world we live in, where technology is a policy question in a way that I don't think people anticipated before, but it's not going to go away. It's something we'll have to live with.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jim. A great
My
conversation.
pleasure. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore's podcast channel. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and leave us a rating and review on Spotify, Apple, Google, and other podcast platforms. If you enjoyed this episode, please spread the word by sharing it across your network. For more information about the Chamber and what we do, visit our website at www.britcham.org.sg and tune in next time for a brand new episode.